Now, I want to draw more widely than just on Augustine for our discussion of ethics, because in its ethics, you see the essence of Christianity most clearly, if you haven't already. To begin with, the essence of ethics for Augustine is that, as it has often been put, not a matter of right living, but of right loving. Loving, of course, primarily God, and only secondarily and derivatively the neighbor. In other words, the essence of the good life is not in what you accomplish or create during this life on earth, but rather in giving the proper inner emotional allegiance to the true dimension, to God. What counts above all is your inner state, not your outer actions. They are only important insofar as they reflect your inner state. Now, this is the primacy of motive over action that we saw in discussing the Stoics last time. As we can also put it, it's the primacy of the inner over the outer, which is the way historians usually characterize it at this point in time. And it's much more intense than in the case of the Stoics, because we now have a fully religious ethics with little pretense at being worldly or rational. Now, this attitude, call it the primacy of the inner over the outer, can be expressed another way. The primacy of consciousness over existence, or in terms of man's nature, of the soul over the body. And in this form, of course, it's the standard soul-body dichotomy present in Greek thought since the Pythagoreans and the Orphics, and Augustine, as we will see, adopts it with a vengeance, the soul-body dichotomy. Man is a temporary union of two distinct substances, the soul and the body. Aristotle is wrong in saying that man is an integrated unity of soul and body. Augustine's definition is man is, quote, a soul that uses a body, unquote. In other words, he's basically a soul with allegiance to the other dimension, and the body, since Adam's fall, has become the prison of the soul. Now, permit me to utter one enigmatic sentence here, which I will explain several lectures from now, which will be intelligible only to those of you who already know Descartes. Augustine's emphasis on the primacy of the soul over the body, or more broadly, on the primacy of the inner over the outer, has had overwhelming results in every branch of philosophy, not simply metaphysics or ethics. It is a profoundly primacy of consciousness approach to philosophy, and it is responsible for Descartes' distinctive approach to philosophy. His cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. For those of you who know that one, Descartes got it from Augustine. For those of you who don't know it, just forget what I said altogether, and I'll mention it again when we get to Descartes. All right, now let us turn to the content of the characteristic Christian ethics. And first, its evaluations of life on earth and of man. I have already stated their evaluations on these points, but I must let Augustine speak for himself, so that you will get a real sense of his way of looking at the universe. The conclusions in a nutshell, of course, are that life on earth is hell and human nature is depraved, but nothing makes it as clear as Augustine himself. I quote now from The City of God, a very, very extended passage. Quote, that the whole human race has been condemned in its first origin. This life itself, if life it is to be called, bears witness by the host of cruel ills with which it is filled. Is not this proved by the profound and dreadful ignorance which produces all the errors that enfold the children of Adam, and from which no man can be delivered without toil, pain, and fear? Is it not proved by man's love of so many vain and hurtful things, which produces gnawing cares, disquiet, griefs, fears, wild joys, quarrels, lawsuits, wars, treasons, angers, hatreds, deceit, flattery, fraud, theft, robbery, perfidy, pride, ambition, envy, murders, parricides, cruelty, ferocity, wickedness, luxury, insolence, impudence, shamelessness, fornications, adulteries, incests, and the numberless uncleannesses and unnatural acts of both sexes, which it is shameful so much as to mention? sacrileges, heresies, blasphemies, perjuries, oppression of the innocent, calumnies, plots, falsehoods, false witnessings, unrighteous judgments, violent deeds, plunderings, and whatever similar wickedness has found its way into the lives of men, though it cannot find its way into the conception of pure minds. Who can describe, who can conceive the number and severity of the punishments which afflict the human race? Pains which are not only the accompaniment of the wickedness of godless men, but are a part of the human condition and the common misery. What fear and what grief are caused by bereavement and mourning, by losses and condemnations, by fraud and falsehood, by false suspicions, and all the crimes and wicked deeds of other men. For at their hands we suffer robbery, captivity, chains, imprisonment, exile, torture, mutilation, loss of sight, the violation of chastity to satisfy the lust of the oppressor, and many other dreadful evils. What numberless casualties threaten our bodies from without, extremes of heat and cold, storms, floods, inundations, lightning, thunder, hail, earthquakes, houses falling, or from the stumbling or shying or vice of horses, from countless poisons in fruits, water, air, animals, from the painful or even deadly bites of wild animals, from the madness which a mad dog communicates, so that even the animal which of all others is most gentle and friendly to its own master becomes an object of intenser fear than a lion or dragon, and the man whom it has by chance infected with this pestilential contagion becomes so rabid that his parents, wife, children dread him more than any wild beast. What disasters are suffered by those who travel by land or sea? What man can go out of his own house without being exposed on all hands to unforeseen accidents? Returning home sound and limb, he slips on his own doorstep, breaks his leg, and never recovers. Is innocence a sufficient protection against the various assaults of demons? That no man might think so, even baptized infants who are certainly unsurpassed in innocence are sometimes so tormented that God who permits it teaches us hereby to bewail the calamities of this life and to desire the felicity of the life to come. As to bodily diseases, they are so numerous that they cannot all be contained even in medical books. And in very many or almost all of them, the cures and remedies are themselves tortures, so that men are delivered from a pain that destroys by a cure that pains. From this hell upon earth there is no escape, save through the grace of the Savior Christ, our God and Lord. Unquote. And one very brief summary now from Augustine. Quote, "Let everyone then who thinks with pain on all these great evils, so horrible, so ruthless, acknowledge that this is misery. And if anyone either endures or thinks of them without mental pain, this is a more miserable plight still, for he thinks himself happy because he has lost human feeling." Unquote. As to man, he writes, quote, he addresses God, but he means this to be taken universally, not just as a statement about himself, quote, "Thou didst set me face to face with myself that I might behold how foul I was, and how crooked and sordid, bespotted and ulcerous," unquote. You see, by contrast, that for Plato, life was a laugh a minute, and man was a superhero. Now, in such a state, all that counts is escape. In other words, reunion with God in heaven. However, declares Augustine, even in theory, it is not possible for all men to go to heaven, because divine justice requires that some men be eternally damned to pay for Adam's sin. There are therefore two groups of men mingled on this earth, those belonging to what Augustine calls the city of God, and those belonging to the earthly city. The former have received God's grace and are going to spend eternity in heaven at God's side. The latter are those who have not received God's grace and are destined to go to hell and spend eternity attacked by worm, fire, and demons. Now you see that the very important thing is to get into the right city. How do we do this? What steps can we take on our own to earn entry into the right city? None whatever. That question betrays a Pelagian bias. Remember the doctrine of original sin. We are utterly stained by sin. On our own, we cannot take a step in the direction of virtue. There is no way whatever we can earn our way into heaven. Otherwise, you're back in the position of Pelagius. We are helplessly dependent on God's decision. On their own, according to Augustine, all men deserve nothing but to go straight to hell. However, God is merciful. He decides to extend grace to certain men, to convert them from sin to virtue, and thereby permit these men into heaven. Now, this is a free act on God's part. Prior to grace, we are all inherently vicious. And we have no claim on God's grace. It's mercy on his part, not justice. Now, if all men are equally corrupt, to start with, how does God decide whom to select for grace? The official answer is this is inexplicable to man. And you see now why hope is a cardinal Christian virtue. And you see here the utter dependence of man on God. In epistemology, man depends on God's illumination for knowledge, above all for faith and revelations. In ethics, he depends on God's grace for virtue. And in metaphysics, of course, man is a semi-real creature, created, run, and ruled by God. Throughout, man is utterly, totally, helplessly dependent at the mercy of God's inexplicable decrees and decisions. This is characteristic of Christian philosophy at this period, and profoundly in contrast to any characteristically Greek view. Now, if you object that it isn't fair for God to select some sinners out of the rest and give them grace and entry into heaven, the standard answer is it is not that God is unfair. The way that I've often heard it put is, imagine a millionaire who owns his money and gives some people money as a free gift. Well, that is not unfair to the other people to whom he doesn't give money. They didn't have any claim on it. Now, I might say that this is a very poor analogy. To have a more accurate analogy, you'd first say that the millionaire comes in, cripples millions of victims, then leaves some of them absolutely chained and gagged and at his mercy while handing out food and money to the rest. Then you could have a parallel, but then you'd have a problem. You might ask, if all this much is true, why have any ethics at all? You can't achieve happiness on earth. You can't even earn entry into heaven. For what purpose would you take any action then? What would be in it for you, the actor? And of course the answer is that is a corrupt question. God has ordained, he has commanded that you act in certain ways, and these commandments must be obeyed because God commanded them. The highest virtue is obedience to God, doing your duty because it is your duty. Indeed, Adam's sin, as we saw, for which all mankind was condemned, was the sin of disobedience, of setting up his own code of values and not listening to God. The true Christian must abandon the attempt to work out a rational ethics or any code of values on his own. Ethics is a matter of the decrees of God. Whatever they are, you must obey, and not in the name of your own happiness, even your long-run happiness either. You are not, in the true spirit of Christianity, to be making a practical calculation, saying to yourself, in effect, well, let's see, God has all this power, and he wants me to do these things, so okay, I'll do it, but my inner calculation is I'll get what's coming to me. I'll have a life of ecstasy and joy in the future, and that's why I'm doing it. It's in effect a trade with God, and he better come through when the chips are down. If you take that attitude, you are anathema to Christianity. Your attitude is supposed to be, thy will be done, not thy will be done if I get a lot of fun out of it. Now, I should say, out of fairness, that Christianity is definitely inconsistent on this point. Everybody prior to Kant is inconsistent on this point. There are several anti-duty, pro-egoist elements in Christianity. To mention them briefly, the emphasis on the salvation of your own individual soul, the statement that you will be rewarded with eternal happiness if you make it, and it's your own eternal happiness that you personally will experience, which quickly became the idea that otherworldly happiness is the reward for your virtue. The statement even of Jesus that you should love thy neighbor as thyself implies that you can love yourself to some extent. Now, all of these elements of egoism are legacies of the Greek influence on Christianity. All of them were extirpated by Kant. Until that time, however, they existed. Nevertheless, they were in conflict with the distinctively Christian element, which is that you obey the commandments out of reverence and love for God and a recognition that he has created you and therefore has a right to command his creatures. In this respect, Christianity is a typical duty ethics. Well, now, what is it that God commands? What does he want of us? Having created this world and placed man in it, what he wants primarily, so it appears, is that man should turn away from life on earth and turn his attention to God. Renunciation of pleasures from life on earth, concentration on one's otherworldly destiny, a brushing aside of this life as a snare, a temptation, an evil seducer of your religious purity, those are the main themes of Christian ethics. As Scripture says in a line which contains the keynote to the whole ethics, quote, he that loveth his life shall lose it. He that hateth it shall gain it unto life eternal, unquote. Or as it's put elsewhere in Scripture, quote, whereunto ye who laugh now, for ye shall mourn and weep, and blessed are ye that weep now, for ye shall laugh, unquote. Now, you may think that this is a primitive view that Christianity has long since abandoned. And so I want to call your attention to a few brief quotes from Bishop Fulton Sheen in regard to Christianity's attitude to suffering on earth. In a book called Life is Worth Living, Bishop Sheen writes, quote, our capacity for pain is greater than our capacity for pleasure. Suffering reaches the point where we feel we can endure it no longer, and yet it increases and we endure it. But pleasures very quickly reach a peak and then begin to decline. Age decreases the capacity for pleasures. Though pain never turns into a pleasure can turn into a pain. Tickling may be funny at first, but it can also become excruciatingly painful. Our capacity for pain is greater because the good Lord intended that all pain should be exhausted in this world. The divine plan is to have real joys in the next life. And skipping a little bit, quote, never losing our love of God, we can then find reasons for supporting pain. If we have ruined our health by excesses, we impose upon ourselves dietary laws and avoid delicacies out of love for our health. One can do the same with the soul. One can say, I will accept this particular suffering in order to make reparation for my own faults. Or we can also offer up our suffering for others. Now get this. Doctors will graft skin from one part of the body to the face if the face is burned. Those suffering from anemia receive a transfusion of blood from another member of society to cure them of that disease. If it is possible to transfuse blood, it is also possible to transfuse sacrifice. If it is possible to graft skin, it is also possible to graft prayer. We have blood banks for our own soldiers, that their lives may be saved through our sacrifice of blood. Pain, agony, disappointments, injustices, all these can be poured into a heavenly treasury from which the anemic, sinful, confused, ignorant souls may draw unto the healing of their wings. Thus, through love of God, suffering becomes sacrifice. The great mystery of the world is not what people suffer, it is what they miss when they suffer. They could be minting coinage for their own salvation and the salvation of the world. The tragedy of wasted pain, the unsanctified tears, the dull aches, the nauseating pains, the infuriating double crosses. How much of these are wasted and thereby converted into curses because those who suffer them have no one to love, unquote. Now, the style and the imagery and metaphors are revealing. You can just see him hugging suffering to his breast, counting man's aches, pains, nausea, and tears like a miser counting his money, running his fingers through his treasure. And he is valid in his choice of metaphor. By the time of Christianity, suffering as such, that is on earth, has become a value. So much for Christianity as an ethics which preaches happiness on earth. Now to return to the early Christians for whom there is significantly more excuse. A study of the literature of the period, including the Bible, which, by the way, you should read it, makes points, and has been very influential. A study of the literature of the period is required for you to gain any idea of how violently the early church was anti-life. It preached that, woe unto ye who laugh, for you shall mourn and weep. And it was very systematic in ensuring, if you followed its rules, that you would weep now. For instance, I wouldn't even mention the church's attitude to business or industry if they had known about those phenomena in the modern sense, but take such simple things as food, drink, and shelter. What should your attitude be? Well, a true Christian was to pay no attention to them. Take no thought of the morrow, what ye shall eat, nor what ye shall drink, nor wherewithal ye shall be clothed. All that is distractions, and also temptations, because they are pleasurable. They constitute a source of enjoyment of this life. Now, of course, you must eat and drink, otherwise you would amount to committing suicide, which is forbidden. The solution, declared Augustine, is to look upon food and drink as medicine. Take what is required to sustain life, but stop before you start getting pleasure out of it. However, there is another peril here which God in his wisdom has placed before us. Even if you eat the modest amount necessary for life, there's a certain pleasure in swallowing it, in the taste and savor of it, or in quenching your thirst, for instance, or in going to sleep at night when you're tired. And this seriously bothered Augustine. It's what we can call the problem of pleasure. And the problem is how to sustain yourself in the most frugal way without enjoying it. Now, Francis of Assisi, many centuries later, illustrates one solution to this problem. I quote you from St. Bonaventura's biography, which is an admiring biography. Quote, he, St. Francis, restrained his sensual appetites with such strict discipline as that he would barely take what was necessary to support life. For he was wont to say that it was difficult to satisfy the needs of the body without yielding unto the inclinations of the senses. Wherefore he would hardly and but seldom allow himself cooked food when in health. And when he did allow it, he would either sprinkle it with ashes, or by pouring water thereupon, would as far as possible destroy its savor and taste. Of his drinking of wine, what shall I say, when even of water he would scarce drink what he needed, while parched with burning thirst. I interject to say that many of the saints drank water in which laundry had been washed. Continuing the quote, the bare ground for the most part served as a couch unto his wearied body, and he would often sleep sitting with a log or a stone placed under his head, and clad in one poor tunic, he served the Lord in cold and nakedness, unquote. The same pattern of renunciation appears in every area of life on the Christian view. Sex, of course, is obvious. It is to be condemned if pursued for pleasure on the identical grounds, because sex for pleasure would be love of this world and of pleasure in this world rather than of God. And so the church doctrine was sex is permissible only for procreation on exactly the same grounds and in the same manner as food is permissible only for medicine. One part of those doctrines was given up on food in the Renaissance. The other continued on. That was given up by most people, that is to say. The most consistent religious people take it still, food and sex, same view, for the same reasons. As to sex, for instance, St. Francis, I won't bother to read it to you, he was characteristically would strip himself naked and jump into a snow heap whenever he felt the onset of sexual desire in order to rout the tempter. Now, I refer you to a book which I always used to read at this point. It's called Sex in History by G. Rattray Taylor. The book is no good philosophically. The man is a Freudian. But if you ignore his interpretation, it is filled with the most fantastic documentation of what human sexual practices have been, including those of the church. They are simply not imaginable by the wildest science fiction imagination unless you read them. And of course, today, this view of sex is the source of all the anti-contraception, anti-abortion, the source of the view that the truly holy people, the priests and the nuns, must abstain, etc. The Christian attitude to wealth, that of course speaks for itself. You know the one about the rich man and the camel. What should your attitude be to yourself? Well, essentially, you should recognize the facts. Namely, you're stained with sin, you're worthless, and you should estimate yourself accordingly. Consequently, the great virtue is humility. The great vice, the greatest vice, is pride. Recognize that you are human, which means you are a miserable, helpless sinner. Saint Benedict in the 6th century drew up a list of rules as to how the monk should go about acquiring true humility. He outlined a number of the steps that you should take, and here I give you a few of those steps. His scriptural text is Matthew, quote, "Whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted." And now here's from Benedict, quote, I just give you a few of these steps. Now the first step of humility is this: to escape destruction by keeping ever before one's eyes the fear of the Lord, to remember always the commands of the Lord. The second, that a man should not delight in doing his own will and desires, but should imitate the Lord. Fourth, that a man endure all the hard and unpleasant things and even undeserved injuries that come in the course of his service without wearying or withdrawing his neck from the yoke. Sixth, that the monk should be contented with any lowly or hard condition in which he may be placed, and should always look upon himself as an unworthy laborer, not fitted to do what is entrusted to him. Seventh, that he should not only say, but should really believe in his heart that he is the lowest and most worthless of all men. 11th, that the monk, when he speaks, should do so slowly and without laughter, softly and gravely, and that he should not be loud of voice. 12th, that the monk should always be humble and lowly, not only in his heart, but in his bearing as well. Now, when the monk has ascended all these steps of humility, he will arrive at that perfect love of God which casteth out all fear. I note, by the way, a couple pages later, he goes on to say that the monks, quote, should not have personal property. The sin of owning private property should be entirely eradicated from the monastery. No one shall presume to give or receive anything except by the order of the abbot. No one shall possess anything of his own, books, papers, pens, or anything else, unquote. You see how consistent the philosophy is. You contrast this with Aristotle's magnanimous man. Benedict's monk and Aristotle's magnanimous man, or St. Francis versus the magnanimous man, are the two perfect symbols of two radically opposite philosophies. What about now what Aristotle called the intellectual virtues? The study of science, physics, astronomy, math, etc. The attempt to understand by reason the laws of the universe. In Book 10 of the Confessions of Augustine, having detailed a whole host of physical temptations standing in the way of man that he has to overcome, Augustine writes a very important section, which I quote an excerpt from, quote, "I must now speak of a different kind of temptation, more dangerous than these, than the physical, because it is more complicated. For in addition to our bodily appetites, which make us long to gratify all our senses and our pleasures, and lead to our ruin if we stay away from you," he's speaking to God, "by becoming their slaves, the mind in addition is also subject to a certain propensity to use the physical senses, not for self-indulgence of a physical kind, but for the satisfaction of its own inquisitiveness. This futile curiosity masquerades under the name of science and learning. And since it derives from our thirst for knowledge, and sight is the principal sense by which knowledge is acquired, in the Scriptures it is called gratification of the eye, E-Y-E. In many translations that comes out the lust of the eyes. It is to satisfy this unhealthy curiosity, I'm quoting, that freaks and prodigies are put on show in the theater. And for the same reason men are led to investigate the secrets of nature, which are irrelevant to their lives, although such knowledge is of no value to them and they wish to gain it merely for the sake of knowing," unquote. So science, learning represent lusts also, this worldly loves and concerns which are futile and to be suspended. And of course there are many more reasons why science must go. It's arrogant of puny man to pursue science on his own. What God wants man to know, God will reveal in his own good time. And if he doesn't reveal something, it is sheer snooping. It is sheer nosiness to go prying into the mysteries of the universe. After all, it's God's world, not man's. And besides, there is no answer to any question anyway. The answer to everything is, that's how it is because God willed it. It's a part of the plan. Everything is a miracle, in effect, and that, you see, is inherent in the idea of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. There are no natural laws. All of nature is unnatural on this approach, and science is therefore impossible. Besides, your goal is not to study this world, but to get out of it, as though you were in jail. And besides, what is the point of studying nothing, or, quote, almost nothing? In other words, we have reached a complete reversion to the pre-Thales era, the era before philosophy and science. Now you have to read the Confessions, and I suggest if you do, you read the translation by Pine Coffin in the Penguin edition. That is, without question, the best translation, the most modern. You have to read the Confessions to get any real sense of the Christian approach, the acute sense of sin, the absolute power of God, the utter irrelevance of this life, including science. Augustine remarks in passing, for instance, in a line that reveals volumes. I don't remember the exact words, but the idea was he's confessing his sins to God, and he says at one point, just in passing, "I used to study the liberal arts in those days because I was a worthless good-for-nothing," unquote. And he proceeds on as though that's self-evident, you see. That's this worldly concern. At one point in the Confessions, Augustine gives himself a temptation rating. And the problem of temptation was, of course, acute for Christianity. The Greeks, at least Aristotle and Socrates, never had any equivalent of this because they held virtue as knowledge. You can understand and reason why certain things are right, and once you understand it, you will want to do it because you will want to achieve your own welfare. But of course, the Christians have a radically different view. Virtue's content is unintelligible, and when you actually act on it, it's in direct conflict with everything that would make life enjoyable. And consequently, there's an irresistible, chronic, inescapable temptation to pursue the evil which the Christian has to fight against constantly. Augustine summarizes the actual reason very, very aptly, but it doesn't change his mind why he is in such agony. "In this world, in this state," but he means world, quote, "in this state I am fit to stay, unwilling though I am. In that other state," namely heaven, "where I wish to stay, I am not fit to be. I have double cause for sorrow," unquote. And so he does. In this temptation rating, he goes down to see whether, since he has been converted to Christianity, he is still getting pleasure from things in the physical world. He checks himself on dreams, on eating and drinking, on smell, and he thinks he's okay on smell, for instance, but that he might be wrong. On sound, does he get any pleasure out of sound? And he thinks that perhaps he's overly partial to the singing of hymns from the point of view of enjoying the music, and so on and so on. But perhaps the most interesting one, passing over many, is he gets sometimes pleasure out of his own humility. He takes a certain pride in his own humility, which is, of course, unspeakable. Somebody once told me about a dedicated Catholic, apparently actually committed seriously to Catholicism, who has systematically cheated on his wife, committed adultery. And this person was confronted by the question, how can you reconcile this with Catholicism, to which you're supposed to believe, and the person returned the answer, this is absolutely in keeping with my Catholicism, because the supreme virtue is humility. If I followed every commandment to the letter, I would be in terrible danger of pride. Therefore, I have to do some wicked things in order to pump up my humility. Now, you see the inescapable problem of any ethics which preaches humility. If the top virtue is the conviction that you're no good, then as soon as you achieve it, you become good. So attaining it destroys it. Now, I have said virtually nothing this evening about the whole altruist side of Christianity, the love thy neighbor element, although, of course, that's the best known in the modern world. It was by no means the most important in the medieval world. It's only since Kant, since the 18th century, that has become the big thing in Christianity. Because it's well known, however, and because you are an audience of students of objectivism, I assume that the relation between this side of Christianity and the ones I've mentioned so far is clear. It's all part of the general process of renouncing life and forbidding independent rational judgment. Just as you are supposed to abandon independent judgment in scientific matters, so in dealing with people. Just as you want unearned grace from God, so you must extend unearned love and forgiveness to others. Judge not, that ye be not judged. And just as you are to divest yourself of selfish pleasures in dealing with the physical world, so in dealing with people. You are not to love only those who give you happiness, those who meet your standards, those who are good in your eyes. That is pagan, egoistic, arrogant, this worldly love. No, your distinctive virtue qua Christian is to love men who do not meet your standards, who do not give you pleasure, to love men who are out to harm you. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use and persecute you, etc. What they do to you doesn't matter. It's just this life. Love of God is all that counts, and love of the enemy is proof of your selflessness and obedience. If men harm you, forgive them unto 70 times 7 times. If they strike one cheek, turn the other. If they steal your coat, give them your cloak also. If they compel you to go 1 mile against your will, go with them 2. Who are you, miserable sinner, to cast the first or even the second stone? In other words, the whole altruism, love thy neighbor axis of Christianity, as I think you can easily see, is completely consistent with the rest of it. Now, I've had to omit even a brief sketch of 2 elements in Augustine's philosophy that I had wanted to mention, but there is no time. One is his politics, and the other is his distinctive and very influential theory of history, a theory which was particularly influential on people like Hegel and Marx, to say nothing of Mussolini and Hitler. But I'll have to say that for the question period if you ask me. For now, I want to conclude by summarizing the essence of Augustinian Christianity. And it comes to this: man is to abnegate himself, renounce the concern for his own pleasure and happiness, give up his mind, his science, his independent judgment. He regard himself as a worthless creature stained by sin in the grip of an all-powerful destiny, helplessly at its mercy. His only goal blindly to have faith and blindly to obey the commands of that power, hope that it will take undeserved pity on him and release him from bondage one day. That glorious day when it's all finally over for him, the day when he gets his final exit permit, death. Now, how long can man survive on this view of man and of life? I answer in one sentence. The next centuries of human history are called the Dark Ages. To put it briefly, it is as follows. Time is made up of the past, the present, and the future. Is it real? Well, let's consider them separately. The past obviously doesn't exist. The future obviously doesn't exist. Not now. It will exist, but it never actually exists because when it exists, it becomes the present. So of the three, if there's any chance for time to be real, it's only the present. But how long is the present? Suppose you say it's an hour. Well, the whole hour doesn't exist at any one instant. So what actually exists at any one instant? A tiny, tiny fragment of time. How tiny? Well, it can't have any size at all. Because even if it has two parts, one part would have to exist when the other didn't. In other words, the present is an infinitesimal fragment. But an infinitely small fragment can't exist. It's nothing. It has no extension. Therefore, the present is unreal also. Therefore, time is a myth. There is no time. I once heard someone present this argument and say, I'm sorry, I have no time to answer questions. My train is leaving. Now, however, said Augustine, we have to try to explain where does the appearance of time come from, granted it's not a reality. And his answer is, time is a subjective feature. It's something contributed to experience by man. It's a product of the way the human mind operates. And the same is true of space. But those two are twins. They always go along together. Time, for Augustine, is a feature of the human mind. And if you obliterated man, you would obliterate time. To say that something is present is simply to say something is perceived. To say that something is past is simply to say human beings remember it. They have a memory of it. To say that it is future is simply to say human beings anticipate it. Now, it follows, therefore, that since human beings came into existence only with the creation of the world, time came into existence only with the creation of the world. And there is therefore no meaning to the question, what was God doing before he created the world? Because there was no before. Before is a temporal concept and is inapplicable until the world comes into existence. Moreover, there's no use asking such questions as, does God know in advance what Adam is going to do? God is not in time. Therefore, from his point of view, there is no in advance. God is in eternity, timeless. For him, what we call past, present, and future is one timeless span without extension. And therefore, there's no question about God knowing in advance. Now, you see, this was a very convenient theory. It was the theory taken over by Kant, who says explicitly, but with more systematic arguments than this, he didn't use Augustine's arguments, that time and space are simply subjective human products, and that therefore, of course, Kant said true reality is therefore unknowable. Augustine said, no, true reality is knowable by faith. Well, Kant, as he grew older, said that too, so. Just a couple of last points. If you want to classify theories of time in your own mind, there's essentially three different theories of time. One that holds that time is objective, that is to say, a feature of reality external to man, and absolute, that is to say, a reality which would exist even if all physical objects were removed. Newton, for instance, held this. It's called the absolute theory of time and space. Space is like a gigantic container. Time is a stream of instants. And even if you obliterated all physical things, space and time would still be there. Second is the view that time and space are objective. That is, they're features of reality independent of man, but they are relational in character, not entities. This is known as the relative theory. Time and space as relative or relational. And that was the view, of course, taken by Aristotle. And we presented that under him. I won't repeat that. And thirdly, the view that time and space are subjective, that they are features of the human mind. That's the idealist tradition from Augustine, and even in a way implied in Plato, but not nearly so crudely as in Augustine, all the way on through Kant and all of his disciples. Now, without going further into it, what is the answer to Augustine's argument? In a word, the same as the answer, I mean, you could say many things, but to confine myself to just one point, the same as the answer to Zeno's paradoxes. You cannot divide infinitely. You will never, therefore, reach the actual infinitesimal. Whatever you reach will always be finite. That's a lead, and I think that's all that is required. It really is a parlor game masquerading as a philosophy. It's exactly on the level of Zeno's paradoxes. Augustine's theory of history. Yes. Augustine's philosophy of history was an attempt to find meaning in the progression of human history. He wrote The City of God, his major opus, to explain the laws governing history and therefore to answer the question, why did Rome fall? He wrote it right after Rome fell. And the pagans were saying that Rome fell because it turned to Christianity instead of to the old pagan gods. Augustine's point was that Rome hadn't embraced Christianity soon enough or completely enough, and that's why it's fell. But you should understand that the fall of Rome to the ancient world was the exact equivalent to what the fall of the United States to Russia would be. It was the end of the world, truly the end of the world. It immediately went into the Dark Ages and never regained, never recovered till the Renaissance. Now, Augustine's explanation was to take away the onus from Christianity for this catastrophe. And his view was history has an intelligible pattern. It is not simply a series of individual human choices and actions. It has a purpose. It is teleological. This is the theory of teleology applied now to human history. It's going somewhere. It has a direction. It's structured in effect like a well-made play, not one by Beckett and Ionesco, but a well-made play. It has a beginning, a middle, a climax, and a denouement. The climax, of course, being Jesus' appearance on earth. Now, this was overwhelmingly important. I don't mean simply the idea that history has a meaning or that there are laws of history, but the idea that history has an inner motive and purpose of its own, and that as a whole it tells a story leading to an ultimate fulfillment. That is a deeply religious interpretation of history. And, of course, that is the absolute basis of Hegel's theory of history, that history operates through a series of stages aiming finally at the true fulfillment of the absolute. It is the basis of the Marxist theory of history, that history is the progression of economic forces moved ultimately by the climax it's going to reach, namely the classless society. It is the basis of the fascist and Nazi racist interpretation of history, that the meaning of history is the progressive realization and triumph of the Aryans. All those are simply ringing the changes on the Augustinian view. More than that, there's another crucial point. Remember the city of God versus the earthly city. The two races of men mingled on the face of the earth. The one chosen by God, given grace and promised triumph. The one not given grace by God, doomed to vice and ultimate holocaust in hell. Now, Augustine said you can interpret all of history in terms of the conflict between these two cities. The members of each are predestined, and their interaction and conflict are the ingredients that make up the flow of history. Now, this idea of a dichotomy within history, that all history can be explained in terms of the interaction, in effect, of a value superior class, a predestined collective, and a value inferior class, a predestined inferior, and the clash and conflict between them was taken over by Hegel, by Marx, by Hitler, in different form, of course. Hegel says it is the Germans versus the non-Germans, which he substitutes for the God-oriented versus the non-God-oriented. Marx, and is therefore a profound nationalist, Hegel. Marx couches the whole thing in congenial to his own philosophy in economic terms. It is the capitalist versus the proletariat, or more broadly, the haves versus the have-nots, which have battled throughout history. And, of course, the Nazis do the thing in biological terms. It is the Aryans versus the non-Aryans, or the Aryans versus the Jews. All of that is simply, again, ringing the changes on the basic Augustinian collectivist, determinist, teleological interpretation of history. That's the two central points I would make, and therefore, on this point alone, Augustine has had more influence than just about any other philosopher. If to be humble in this world is a virtue, why is it a punishment in the next and the reverse with pride? I'm not sure I get that. Is the meaning of that question, why is it that the two worlds are in opposition to each other? So that if you're supposed to be humble in this world, but you can exalt yourself in the next one. You're supposed to be miserable down here, but you can be happy in the next one. Is that the meaning of the question? Why are the two worlds opposite to each other? And if so, it's a very good question. Nobody who ever preached a super reality ever took the following line. Nobody ever said, yeah, there's another world, but this one is great. Enjoy this life, live in this world, and when you're finished, then you go to another terrific world. Never was taken. The view has always been, this world is rotten, evil, defective, etc., and therefore get no happiness out of it, abase yourself in it, etc., and then you'll hit the jackpot in the next dimension. Now, there are various reasons you could give why the two dimensions have always been construed as opposed to each other. Philosophically, the answer is because there is only one reality. No matter who says what, the human mind cannot conceive of two realities. Reality means what is real, what exists, everything. And therefore, if you say there's two of them, you have to say one of them isn't really real. It's deficient, defective, etc., and therefore you have to sacrifice. That's the philosophic reason. If I can permit myself, with the proper preface, to make a psychological observation, which I normally oppose in any philosophy course. Of course, the reason is the motivation of mysticism. A person is inclined to mysticism only because they are opposed to this world. They are anti-reality. And they want something that they cannot have in this reality. So they start off hating this world. So it's not a surprise that this world comes out as poor and as the opposite in their philosophy of true reality, as they construe it. But that's a psychological explanation which you have to keep separate in your mind from a philosophical one, because otherwise it becomes the fallacy of ad hominem.